Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As always, I hope your semesters are going well. We are hard at work grading and reading through your mid-semester essay assignments. So we'll hopefully have those grades back to you as soon as we can. I'm always afraid to give a precise date because I'm usually wrong. But I don't think it'll be super long time. And yeah, pretty soon I will also talk a bit about your final project assignments, and I'll be posting some suggested questions on that as well. So for those who would like to start planning ahead, you'll be able to do that very soon. All right. Well, we are through the first week of Zhuangzi, and I am curious. I know I did already ask last week kind of your first general thoughts on Zhuangzi, and most of them were quite positive. Some people found it a little difficult or confusing, but most people seem to be enjoying him, a bit of a change of pace from the other thinkers. But he can be a difficult thinker. Last week, the pre-recorded lecture video looked at chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi on equalizing things, I think is the translation in our textbook. I think you could make a case chapter 2 is the most significant and maybe most challenging chapter of the Zhuangzi. So that's why I'm just giving a space here just in case we are going to sort of review and touch base and dig in more into some of his ideas, so don't worry. But just out of curiosity, I thought I would just give an opportunity before we dive in, just to see if anyone had any particular questions, anything that seemed unclear. I know it's a pretty open question, but yeah, Anna.
I would say that I really haven't had really hard time um with his not teachings but like how he lays out his philosophy principles,
Mhm.
because it's more like I mean like it's kind of like it's easier than like other tests, but this one is just like he just like shows like examples, and then like right after that he just like shows other examples
Right.
and that was a little confusing for me that I
Yeah.
yeah, so I think like and also how he kind of lays out like before he dives into like his principles or like examples, like I think he kind of lays out like some kind of like introduction introduction, and then like that introduction also don't really like feel like relevant to the idea sometimes, or like too baggy
Right.
too baggy or ambiguous, that made me like so like maybe to like think like what's like relevant like relation, well kind of like similarity like relevance to like the next ideal. Well,
Right.
and sometimes I found that like it's not really relevant at all at all, and that was like I think that's like hard time for that was really hard for me to
Yeah, that's fair, I think. Yeah. He's very challenging that way because yeah, he'll have some sort of crazy story lead into some example or digging into some philosophical idea, and then yeah, next thing you know, he's on to another story. Yeah, that's fair, I think. He certainly doesn't necessarily take a moment to pause and kind of lay out what he's trying to say. Yeah, he's very challenging that way. Yeah, that's fair. And I wish I had good advice on that, but I don't know that there's great simple advice for how to approach the text beyond what we've done. Yeah, comment his acceptance of death is quite respectful, something I hope to achieve someday. Yeah, it's a big question with Zhuangzi's view on death. Like it sounds great, and it's an open question how possible it is. But yeah, I do think I certainly find that to be one of the more compelling parts of his philosophy. Yeah, I think so. It helps me, I think, in a lot of ways. I don't know if it's also just as I get older, if for some, it's funny, you think the older I get, the more I'd be concerned about death because I'm getting closer to it, but it bothers me less. But I think Zhuangzi helps me with that. Yeah, I think all of the philosophers we've looked at so far, I'm having the hardest time reading Zhuangzi because it feels like it just goes on, and I have a hard time focusing on the stories. Yeah, I think that's fair too. It's a very particular kind of text. And I guess to be fair, probably. like cramming in a bunch of Zhuangzi readings in the space of 2 weeks is probably not the ideal way to approach his text. I think with his text, it really helps to sit and digest it like in little bits and then come back. So this is definitely a case where the semester structure is not helpful to us necessarily. Um, I still struggle with the text, but to the extent that I do understand it, I do have the advantage that I've read these things more times than I can probably count at this point. Yeah, all very fair thoughts. I was curious to hear people's takes on Zhuangzi so far. He's a really challenging philosopher in a lot of ways. You can kind of understand why some of his stories even in his own stories, his critics and friends talk about how his philosophy meanders and doesn't lead anywhere, and it's very confusing. All right, well, we'll try our best today. I will put in as much effort as I can to make at least perhaps a few of his ideas hopefully a little clearer at least. So we've been introduced to a few of his ideas, each of which may still be very confusing. And I think this is what I repeatedly say with Zhuangzi's philosophy. Maybe I've already said it repeatedly, but if you're still very confused, again, that's very reasonable. We've been looking at Zhuangzi for just a little over a week at this point. That's probably not enough time to understand Zhuangzi. So we have this concept of big knowledge that we introduced last week in our first class. Um, we'll touch on kind of what's going on with that, but I guess as a brief bit of review, that seems to be a perspective, a broader perspective on the world. Understanding how narrow your own perspective is, and then trying as well as you can to be aware of how many other perspectives there are and how different the world looks when you look at it in a very small way versus sort of zooming out. Um, so the little quails kind of really honing in very narrowly on things, all the way to this bird named Breeze, who flies so high he looks down on the earth and everything looks blue. In the pre-recorded lecture video, I made at least an attempt to work through and try to describe this concept of the pipes of heaven. I don't know how clear that was. It's definitely a complicated idea. Everything in chapter 2 is quite difficult. You could probably spend a good month or two just on chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi. But I think the pipes of heaven is similar to big knowledge. Um, but it talks not only about perspective, but also it tries to communicate the idea that ultimately everything in the world is kind of one big totality, and we all exist within that totality as one part of it. Our human minds try to kind of divide it up. We try to explain sort of who's making these things happen. We always think there must be one step outside that's kind of causing things. But Zhuangzi is suggesting that in the end, everything just causes itself. And then, as if big knowledge and the pipes of heaven were not already confusing enough, we introduce this concept of the pivot of the way. And I'll get to that in a moment as well. So I'll try to kind of touch on these points a little bit just to continue to review and try to, I guess, get a sense of what's really going on with Zhuangzi's philosophy. So as we noted, one of the big focuses, and I think this was one of the key elements of this big knowledge idea, Zhuangzi talks a lot about perspective, especially in chapter 1. He wants us to think about the big picture. He wants us to not just look at our really narrow part of the world and assume that's everything. And then importantly, and this connects to that pipes of heaven story, he wants us to think about how things are connected. We'll talk about that more today, but yeah, he wants you to not only think about having a big picture view, but also understanding that as you kind of zoom out and look at the world, you can see how everything is kind of influencing and influenced by everything else. Another big theme in the text is uncertainty. Zhuangzi really seems to think it's maybe a good thing to be a little uncertain. We're all limited by our own narrow perspectives, unavoidably, probably. So uncertainty is actually a kind of wisdom. It's a kind of acknowledgement of the limitations of your experiences and the capacity to know things. The world's always going to be bigger than the things that you can see. And he does seem to suggest that although it is possible to expand your view, to have a bigger perspective, I get the sense he's trying to highlight the fact that ultimately we can never actually be in possession of the full picture. It's just not an option. We're never going to know everything. So he has a very famous story of a kind of metaphor of a frog in a well. So this is a frog more in like a bird bath. But if you imagine there's a deep well, you look down into the well, and the bottom you see a frog. The frog's whole world is the water in that well and what he can see looking up. So if a turtle or a tortoise comes up and looks down at the frog and they speak, if the turtle or tortoise were to try to even communicate the ocean, it would make no sense to the frog because he's saying, like, how can there be that much water anywhere? Like, I'm looking and this is how much water there is. So to some extent, we're all that frog in the well. And to some extent, we can't avoid being that frog in the well. Though I think he does suggest it's possible to at least be aware of your limited knowledge. So he thinks uncertainty is good, or at least wise, I think. But that uncertainty extends also into the basic ways that we try to understand, think about, and communicate reality. So not only is our perspective limited and our knowledge very limited, but the tools that we really sometimes like to think are so powerful and perfect and accurate, the basics of language and logic, ultimately can only take you so far as well. So language and logic, also kind of unreliable. So far, Zhuang just seems like he's just telling us how little we know and how little we can ever know. But he does at least acknowledge language and logic are useful tools. Um, you know, when you communicate to someone with language, he had that metaphor of the puffing of air or the peeping of birds. It's more than that because we can communicate things to other people and some things are understood, but they're limited and they're unreliable. And a large part of this is because the meanings of words and of logical ideas are neither absolute nor eternal. So you can say something and a person can kind of understand what you mean, but that doesn't mean the words are perfectly or accurately describing the world. So that uncertainty also should be extended to the basic tools we use to think and speak. So sometimes Zhuangzi can be a little unnerving because he seems like he's trying to take away all of our feelings of certainty. Yeah, Susanna.
When it comes to like our communication and like explaining about how the world works, I think it also ties into like perception. There's like a course on philosophy of perception. Like sometimes it gets really like metaphysical, but it's sort of like, oh, for a table, like we describe it as like rectangular, it's flat, but then when you look at it at different angles, it's not actually flat. Like maybe it's not four sides, you only see two sides or like just three edges. So like I
Right.
just thought of that when you said about how with communication, we explain things using language, but at the same time, like it's very like abstract as well. It's so hard to be like
Right.
super clear. I can describe what a pen is, but then when I describe the pen, am I really describing it the same way that you're visualizing it in your mind?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so our perceptions also shape that. Yeah, and yeah, if you're trying to describe something, yeah, you may be accurate with the description, but then yeah, the other person looking at it may not see that either. That's a really good point. Anna.
Oh, I think maybe I'm wrong, but like I can perceive this like as well, like kind of differently. That I think Zhuangzi was like he's trying to argue or like counter other philosophers like Lao Tzu or like Mozi, who kind of like makes like this kind of like a fixed ideal is correct or like righteous. that that like I think like also like in the lecture video we also mentioned like how he was thinking that like people tend to frame certain things like wrong or right, and then they um fail to like look at like the problem or like shortcoming of those ideals, and like
Right.
um how I got about like then like rather than like which like the perspective of people, like I don't really like feel like that was like what I was getting, that like oh I didn't really think that like the interest on there's not much interest of perspective, but like or background or like other sources, but like more like that like that's kind of like our tendency to like decide what is right and wrong. Wrong is like makes like us to like looking up, not able to like look other ways
Right.
or realize the problem of certain things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's definitely right. Yeah, that puts it well too. Yeah, so it also, this uncertainty also applies to our ethical conceptions. Yeah. We try to, especially the Moists and the Confucians in his view, yeah, they try to assign what we might call moral or normative values to things, right and wrong. But yeah, that's also a product of perspective and context and non-absolute and non-permanent values. Yeah. So yeah, it kind of applies to everything. So if you really try to make you as uncertain as possible. So that's raised a couple questions. These are questions that have been posed mainly by contemporary scholars. I don't know that these were necessarily questions posed to Zhuangzi in his own life, because they're kind of terms from contemporary philosophy. But one big question that gets asked is whether or not Zhuangzi should be understood as a skeptic. So ultimately, is Zhuangzi someone who denies the possibility of any kind of at least certainty of knowledge, or perhaps any kind of knowledge at all? Is it impossible in Zhuangzi's mind to know anything? Um, and it's a fair question, because when you look at his philosophy, you could, I think, easily read it that way. It's a problematic suggestion because a pure skeptic, someone who thinks it's impossible to ever know anything at all, it kind of it's a self-defeating proposition, because in the end, if you can't know anything, then there's no point writing a book of philosophy, I don't think. But we have a few sort of tantalizing passages in the text where I think Zhuangzi at least hints towards his ideas. I don't know if this is the best example of his supposed skepticism or lack thereof, but this is probably the most famous story from the Zhuangzi. I think most people, if you've ever heard of Zhuangzi at all, you probably at least know the butterfly story. And this is that story in chapter 2 where it just this little story on its own. One night, Zhuangzi dreamt of being a happy butterfly showing off and doing as he pleased, unaware of being Zhuangzi. Suddenly he awoke drowsily Zhuangzi again, and he could not tell whether it was Zhuangzi who had dreamt the butterfly or the butterfly who was dreaming Zhuangzi, but there must be some difference between them. This is called the transformation of things. There's many ways to read this story. Um, that sort of big sigh or deep breath before trying to describe anything from Zhuangzi. Yeah, not understanding Zhuangzi is a very reasonable perspective. So I think there's multiple ways to read this. One way to read it is it's just a commentary on the basic uncertainty that we have. It's just a description of an experience. Zhuangzi one night fell asleep, and in the dream, he was convinced he was a butterfly, totally unaware that he had ever been a human. And when he woke up, kind of in this space, I don't know if you ever woken up from a dream and you're a little confused at first. There's this kind of uncertainty where he's not sure, like, am I Zhuangzi who just dreamt he's a butterfly, or am I a butterfly sort of now dreaming that I'm Zhuangzi? So it might potentially suggest just a kind of general uncertainty that whatever senses we sort of experience and the world we find ourselves in, that's just kind of the world we're in. But we always have to have this level of uncertainty if it's real or if we're perceiving the world as it really is. Another way this has been interpreted is it could be a commentary on death, that he kind of has a moment where he realizes that he has no idea what happens when you die. Maybe there is a kind of afterlife, the life like this butterfly might be a metaphorical symbol of. And maybe you have no idea in that next life that you ever lived a previous one. So it kind of at least hints towards this kind of uncertainty. But yeah, it's so uncertain how to interpret it. But it's a compelling story. It's a powerful image. Another great example. So this is from chapter 17. So this is not one of the inner chapters. So it is open to debate if this is Zhuangzi himself writing or someone writing afterwards. But there's that story in chapter 17 where Zhuangzi and Huizi. So you may remember Huizi is one of the logicians who seems to be a friend of Zhuangzi's. They're wandering on a bridge over the Hao River. And Zhuangzi says, look at those mottled fish out wandering at ease. That's what fish like. So they're walking across this bridge, they're looking down into the water. Zhuangzi sees these fish just kind of, going about in the water, and he says, oh, this is fish at their happiest. Like, this is what they enjoy doing. And then it leads into this big debate where Huizi basically says, how do you know what fish like? You're not a fish. That's what Zhuangzi says, how do you know that I don't know what fish like? You're not me. And then Huizi kind of turns that around and says, well, okay, I'm not you, so I don't know what you like, but also I do know that you're not a fish, and therefore you don't know what fish like. And then Zhuangzi kind of turns it around in a very Zhuangzian way with possibly a joke and says, okay, let's go back to the beginning. When you asked how I knew what fish liked, you had to know I already knew in order to ask. I know it by the Hao River. That's how. So I think most commentators view this as a bit of a cheat. He doesn't really address Huizi's logical propositions here because he kind of plays on two things. He's using language to kind of get back at Huizi here, suggesting, first of all, you said, how do I know what fish like? You can't ask that question unless you acknowledge that I do know what fish like. And then he has kind of probably what was meant to be a pun. I know it by the Hao River. That's how. So the English translation here also kind of makes a bit of a pun. But the key thing here is that the word that is translated as how here can also mean where. So he may also be playing with language here and saying, you asked me how or where I know, and I know it right here, standing at this river. So again, that might be a little confusing, but he basically seems to be suggesting, in a way, one way to interpret it is he's turning it around and saying, he's trying not to play into Huizi's logic, and he's trying to take it back to basics and saying, well, I know it because I'm standing right here looking at the fish. So this is maybe a cruel discussion question because that may be a very confusing story. But based on that story, this is chapter 17. If you have the third edition, it's should have had the chapter ready to go. if you have the third edition, it should be page 260 at the bottom. But in this argument, who do you actually think wins the debate? So this is a chapter from the Zhuangzi text, but some commentators think Huizi actually makes a stronger argument. That in fact, Zhuangzi cannot know what fish like because he's not a fish. Yeah, so we have one response. I find myself siding with Huizi. As a human, I can't truly know the fish's experience because he isn't a fish. Yeah, this resonates with me because it underlies the limitations of understanding life from another being's perspective, especially across different species. We might observe behaviors, but assuming we know the inner experiences of others, particularly animals, stretches our human-centric viewpoints too far. Yeah, that's a pretty strong argument, I think. Yeah, so even if he sees the fish doing it, you could maybe make a kind of case they must enjoy it, but what does enjoy even mean? Yeah, Susanna.
I think like I agree with everybody that's posted that like we don't know like what the fish is. Like we can think that like, oh, if a fish is like acting normal, maybe like they're happy, but at the same time, like how do we know like how fish or like animals express pain or like pleasure? Like that's just such a very like anthropocentrism aspect of like if someone is smiling, therefore they are happy. But we only know that because that's how humans express themselves. But
Right.
animals, we don't know. We just like assume based on their behavior.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good point. Yeah, we kind of it actually touches back to your early point about perception too, doesn't it? Because like the human way of conceptualizing joy is completely shaped by the way that we read other human beings' expressions.
Yeah, and then it's also like, why is it that when like does this human expression matter more than other animals on how they express themselves? Like, why are
Right.
our expression of pain and suffering like more superior to some extent? Or like that's how we always tie like, oh, if there's tears coming out, we always assume it is out of sadness when sometimes it
Right.
could be joy, but then you need to like look more into it, and that like applies to animals as well. If there's tears coming out of their eyes, are they in pain? Is it because they're tired and yawning?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It actually makes me think about some of the ways now I think animals are sometimes depicted in social media. They're very anthropomorphized, I think. Yeah, they're trying
Yeah,
to
and also like someone said, I'm not too sure, I didn't fact check it, but they're like for dogs, if their tails are wagging, it means they're happy. But when it's a cat wagging a tail, it doesn't mean it's happy. It means they're about to attack or they're like really anxious.
right.
I never fact checked that.
Right. Yeah, but I like that. That I could see that being a story in the Zhuangzi, actually. Someone who thinks that a wagging tail of a cat means it's happy and runs towards it and gets attacked or something. I could see that being into the Zhuangzi. Um, yeah, what else? I feel like Huizi makes the stronger argument here. We have no way to know what the fish like because we are not them. We cannot see life from their perspective. We can observe certain behaviors from them, but we ultimately cannot speak for them. Yeah, we cannot speak for them, puts it well. Yeah, everyone so far agrees with Huizi, I think. Um, yeah, let's see, I'm gonna kind of rush through here. Sorry if I skip your answers. It's no comment on your response. Yeah, and as noted, he doesn't, Zhuangzi also doesn't seem to address Huizi's question. Yeah, he kind of uses a pun to get away from the answer. Yeah, it makes a bold assumptions and claims with no evidence to back it up. Okay, yeah. Practical perspective, Huizi is a stronger argument because he challenges the logic behind Zhuangzi's claim. Yeah, but Zhuangzi gives a very spontaneous perspective, in a way not wrong in that sometimes understanding does not require direct experience, but also observation. Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable case as well, that maybe there is a capacity to know to some extent. Oh yeah, Sam.
Hi. Yeah, I kind of understood him to be sort of questioning like the certainty with which Hoizu was speaking. Like I think he was less sort of implying that he knows what a fish likes, and more so like questioning that he like kind of hard to describe. Um, but I don't think he was arguing that he like knows for a fact what the fish likes, but more so like that he can't know that Hoysa can't know that he absolutely for a fact cannot know what the fish like. If that makes
Right.
sense at all. Like
Yeah, I think that makes
challenging
sense.
certainty of either statement, I guess.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, so in that sense, you could read it as Zhuangzi turning it around and suggesting that Huizi is the one who's posing too much certainty.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I
and I
like
think
that.
in terms of the question of like what that implies about the nature of knowledge, I think it sort of just reinforces this idea of like uncertainty. Like I can't know that I know what the fish like, but I also can't know that I don't know what the fish like.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So it's an even deeper uncertainty in that sense. But yeah, it's a kind of freeing uncertainty in a way too, because you also don't know that you don't know. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, Anna.
I maybe I'm wrong, but like at the end of the chapter, Zhuangzi makes point that like he knows I know it by the Hao River. That's how, and that was a little confusing for me because I was like, there's no like really like further explanation what he means by Hao River. But I think I think I mean like the how he ends his claim like with the like nature Hao River. Most likely I think how John is the one who knows the environment. I don't know, I might be wrong because I can't really find any like relevant like information about Howard River, but like I think like Zhuangzi knows like the environment, and then like and also like he might be like the one who has seen the fishes for long time for a long time. So like maybe he's arguing that like, oh, because I know the fish more than you, because I mean like unlike salmon, salmon's purpose like mainly to like go back to their like where they're born or originate from. But this fish is more like they are like kind of like wandering at ease, which means they have no purpose.
Right.
And they are more like really like they have more like free mindset or like freedom to swim that, and that's why I think Zhuangzi knows more like background or information regarding the fish and the environment, and that's how he makes the claim. And then he's like, I think like that's also kind of like support his original argument that like how everyone needs to have broad perspective,
Right.
and maybe that's I don't know. I think that's like what I think about it. But I kind of want to ask a question about like what does he mean by however, or is my interpretation wrong?
Right. No, I think that's fair. Yeah, if he's giving it as a kind of, he's explaining how he builds his knowledge contextually from knowing the environment. And then that fits the pun in the original Chinese, which could be read as, where do I know? I know it by standing here at the river and basically by observing. Yeah. Which touches on as well on Nina's point here, that yeah, maybe what Zhuangzi is doing is he's not commenting on the absolute knowledge, but he's commenting on the question of how he came to that conclusion. Yeah, that's his sort of, yeah, perceived to know in the story could be perceived as meaning personal interpretation of reality. That's really interesting. Oh, we have one defender, another sort of defender of Zhuangzi. There's a few. Yeah, Huizi's argument seems to rotate mainly around presumption, an artificial presumption and insight from a narrowed worldview that a person cannot know about the fish's perspective. Yeah, so in that reading, Zhuangzi is opening up a broader perspective in which maybe fish and human have enough in common that certain things can be kind of gleaned. Okay, yeah, so I won't get a chance to get to all of them, but thank you. These are some pretty insightful readings of the text. One of the reasons I love Zhuangzi, because you can come back to him a million times and still find new insights into reading it. But yeah, I think if nothing else, Zhuangzi points towards, I think, how would I put it? I think Zhuangzi's view in terms of skepticism at least appears to be complex. He's skeptical and he's very doubtful of certainty, but he doesn't seem, especially if you take this as a representative example of his philosophy, he doesn't seem to think it's impossible to know anything. it's just maybe impossible to be, or it's dangerous to be overly certain or narrow-minded, maybe. Yeah, well, there's so much more could be said about that, but we'll kind of rush along. The other question that frequently gets asked about Zhuangzi is whether or not he is a relativist. So this touches especially on that question of does Zhuangzi think it's impossible to ever say anything is right or wrong? Does he think there is no right or wrong? So one way to interpret a relativist is to say that it's somebody who believes truth and morality are not absolute. So a complete moral relativist, like an absolute moral relativist, would be someone who, yeah, really doesn't think right and wrong mean anything at all. And again, I mean, there's enough in the Zhuangzi text to allow for that reading. But again, I don't think the text supports it very well, because if it were the case that Zhuangzi thought there were absolutely no possible conception of right or wrong, then it sort of leads to the question of like, well, then why write a book of philosophy? Like, he seems to think there's a better way to do things at the very least. And I think there's a few ways you could probably summarize this, or at least begin to put together an understanding of Zhuangzi's stance on relativism. It kind of builds out of what we already said about the story of the fish. But at the very least, I think it means we should not attach ourselves to firm, sort of static, unchanging moral truths. Not necessarily because there is no difference between good and bad or right and wrong, but because the way we try to capture right, the way we try to sort of, catch it in one moment in a permanent, eternal, consistent way doesn't work. Because it's kind of like that point Susanna made about perception of a table or a pen. It's like the moment you change your perception of that situation, the moment the context shifts, right and wrong might suddenly look very different. So I think at the very least, Zhuangzi is saying we need to be aware that our ability to know things is simply too limited to ever have really, really strong, definitive opinions on these things. And a big part of this is because the moment we make a claim about the world, we have lost sight of the full picture. And that goes back to some of the points made, I think, in both the first lecture on Zhuangzi last week, but definitely in many of the concepts in chapter 2 that were discussed in the pre-recorded lecture video last week. That the moment you begin describing or defining something, you've already kind of artificially divided the world up. And once you lose sight of the full picture, your claims are imperfect and impermanent. So if nothing else, right and wrong have shifting and uncertain meanings because you're trying to stick them onto situations that may have different possible perspectives or could change depending on what else changes. So that kind of all points towards his general view. I think I would at least argue that although there's a lot of room for interpretation of his text, I personally am not convinced he's a complete skeptic or a complete relativist. But he does seem to think that we need to take on a broader perspective about the world. We need to at least apply this big knowledge approach to life. We should admit the limitations of our knowledge to the extent that we're aware of them. So I think big knowledge sort of offers at least a starting point to his solution to these big problems of our uncertainties. And then I think this concept of standing at the pivot of the way also helps us to understand this a little bit. So the pivot of the way is a pretty difficult concept. So if if you're very confused still about the pivot of the way, again, I think that's pretty reasonable at this point. So what on earth does it mean to stand at the pivot of the way? And feel free to jump in if you have a better way to explain this. There's been many other times where students jumped in and put it much more concisely than I have. But I think the pivot of the way it's kind of a way of taking all of this relativity and uncertainty and then acting in the world in a particular way that's based on a knowledge of this uncertainty and this relativism. So much of chapter 2 is devoted to showing us how the distinctions we make about the world only exist in our own minds. If you declare something beautiful, then by doing so, you're also saying that its opposite is ugly. So you've already created an artificial distinction in the world, where in reality, beauty and ugly don't really have consistent meanings. Conventional standards of beauty in the world are social conventions that change, and individual tastes vary. And of course, when you exit the human world, those perceptions are completely different. So beauty, this even as a kind of constructed social convention, is impermanent and pretty much meaningless. So he plays around. He's also kind of making fun of the logicians here, but he speaks a bit like Huizi here, and I think he's trying to also both make fun of Huizi because he's always making fun of someone, and he's also highlighting that these distinctions are kind of silly, meaningless, and changing all the time. So yeah, nothing in the world is bigger than the tip of an autumn hair, but Mount Tai is small. No one lives longer than a dead child, and Pengzu died young. Pengzu being this famously long-lived mythological figure. Heaven and earth were born alongside me, and the 10,000 things and I are one. In a sense, when you shift your perspective, this is why Huizi loves these paradoxes. All these things are true, even though they sound very counterintuitive. So just to take one example, no one lives longer than a dead child. One way to interpret that is every second that we exist, we change. We exist only in the moment, and we don't, the sort of us at the time, doesn't kind of continue on into the next moment. Kind of a famous philosophical position. So in that sense, a dead child and any other person really do live just as long as each other. So he's really playing with these counterintuitive truths. And then the second point, and this is explained to a large degree in the Pipes of Heaven story, everything actually is part of one great total unity. We divide the world up in our minds when we try to define things and identify things, but actually everything is interconnected. The only way to fully, accurately understand the world would be to see everything all at once at the same time, which we can't actually do. And he plays around with this in chapter 2 as well. There's this sort of baffling passage. If we're already one, so he's talking about this totality, this unity, everything is one. If we're already one, can I say it? So meaning, can I say that we're all one? But since I've said we're one, can I not say it? The unity in my saying make it two. The two in their unity make three. Starting from here, even a clever mathematician couldn't get it, much less an ordinary person. So I think here, at least my interpretation, he's sort of showing that this complicated reality of being a human being in the world. We're all part of one totality, and all the distinctions we try to make are artificial and don't really mean anything. But that's not how we perceive the world. So when he says my unity, or the unity and my saying it make two, basically means if I am commenting on the unity of the world, then by saying that and commenting on that, by acknowledging that everything is one whole to total unity, then actually I'm not existing as a part of that unity because I'm commenting on it. I've already created two things. There's the unity and there's me standing here saying everything is united. And then actually now there's me saying it and there's the united. And then there's my awareness that I and the unity of the world are two things. So that awareness of me commenting on that becomes three. And then he's basically saying the more we try to analyze the world, the more we inevitably divide it up, and it just kind of keeps going on forever. So another point he seems to be making is there are no kind of things that exist independently of everything else. You can never have something that's completely independent. Even though we're constantly viewing things as independent in our own minds. Now again, I feel like with Zhuangzi, I have to just make this statement every 10 to 20 minutes. If this is giving you a headache and you completely lost and have no idea what I'm talking about, again, that's still kind of reasonable at this point with Zhuangzi. 2 weeks is not enough for Zhuangzi. If anyone here has ever had a chance to study Buddhist philosophy, you may also begin to see why Zhuangzi influenced the development of certain types of Buddhist thought in China, because Buddhist philosophy has a lot in common with Zhuangzi. They sound very similar. So yeah, this sort of no things that exist independently of everything else. We have this story from chapter 2 as well, where Penumbra said to Shadow, first you walk and then you stop. First you sit and then you rise. Why are you so restless? So imagine a shadow of a person kind of constantly moving around. And someone's like, why is the shadow constantly moving? And the shadow basically suggests, well, I'm not moving. Something else is kind of making me move. And then shadow says, do I depend on something to be the way I am? Does what I depend on also depend on something to be the way it is? Yeah, and as Shinzo comments, this, I think I would say, especially this Penumbra shadow story, really reminds me of the concept of interdependent arising in Buddhism. So I think this Penumbra shadow one, he's trying to show this kind of endless chain of interconnected causality. So imagine you're looking at a shadow. The shadow exists. It is its own thing. Shadow is basically a section of a space where less light is hitting it because there's an object standing in the way of that light. So what causes the shadow to move? In our minds, we'd say, well, the shadow's not moving, a person is moving. And the person moving is causing the shadow to move. But then what's making the person move? Or even the light. I mean, the shadow is a product of both the person and the light. So it's both the person standing in front causing the shadow and it's the light from behind the person. But then what makes a person do all the things that is then revealed in the shadow's movements? Well, all sorts of things cause a person to behave the way they do as well. And you can kind of keep zooming out, and every action you can find, you'll be able to find another cause behind that action. There's kind of this endless chain. You can never kind of find the original cause of something because everything is interdependent and affecting everything else. Again, very Buddhist if you've ever studied Buddhist philosophy. I'll maybe pause for a second because we've been going through quite a few ideas here. Any questions or thoughts on any of this? We've kind of covered his relativism and his skepticism. in terms of this idea of the totality of things and the interconnectedness, is this making sense, or is it a little confusing still? I'll keep going. I'm hoping it makes sense. I guess that's always my hope. Yeah, Susanna.
I gotta just have a question about, so previously in like the first little bit that we've like studied, it was all like actions and things about like the warring states of like society and like civilization and making like a good society basically. Now, are we straying away from like a response to the warring states and more about like the philosophical kind of like thinking about life? And now we're not really thinking about like, oh, how was this a response to like
Hmm.
the development or like the warring states period? Because like this is way after, right?
No, I guess not. I would say, well, I should say, if your question's about Zhuangzi specifically, then yes, I think with Zhuangzi, because he just like, I guess the elements of the Warring States are definitely in the background of Zhuangzi's philosophy, and you find it in
Okay.
some of his stories. Like for
Mm-hmm.
example, I would say it influences Zhuangzi in as much as the Warring States period was still a very dangerous time to be around,
Okay. Okay.
and it was a very uncertain time.
Mm-hmm.
So Zhuangzi, like if he's writing to a literate audience. So a lot of these people are either planning to go into, probably trying to get a job in government, if you want to put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
um, or are themselves offering kind of solutions to the crisis of the warring states. Um, so Zhuangzi,
So
oh sorry,
warring states still happening while Zhuangzi exists.
yeah. So
Okay.
Zhuangzi's probably alive. Actually, probably either around the same time or quite likely a little after Mengzi.
Mhm.
But still very much in the Warring States period. But he's
Okay.
interesting because I think partially influenced by Yang Zhu and the individualists,
Mhm.
in some ways his response, his philosophical or his philosophy is responding both to some of the dangers and uncertainty of the Warring States period,
Okay.
but also just to the nature of life itself. So maybe one of his biggest innovations, even though he is drawing from the individualists in doing so, but one of his big innovations is basically to make a philosophy that isn't trying to address these political crises. He's basically saying, look, are you going to fix these problems? Probably not. And whatever happens, life is still going to be this uncertain, sticky mess. Um, So I think in a lot of ways, Zhuangzi himself just doesn't seem particularly interested in those big political questions.
Got it. Thank you for the
Yeah,
clarification. I was
yeah,
like, we were focused so much about like warring states stuff and like society, and now we're talking about this. Okay, thank you for the
yeah.
clarification.
No, very good question. Other people may have been wondering the same thing. Yeah, Zhuangzi is just so different that it does almost feel like we're in a different class for a moment. Um, but yeah, but we'll be returning to the Warring States soon. Yeah, so Zhuangzi here, he is talking about standing at the pivot of the way. This requires seeing and understanding the fundamental unity of all things. So first, to the extent a person can ever do this, he wants you to sort of look about and be aware that all the things that you think are certain, all the terms you use, all the sort of moral values you apply to things, they're temporary, they're impermanent, they're uncertain, and everything is interconnected. So he wants people to occupy a position that does not assign fixed truths to things. He wants for him, kind of the ideal way to live is to, I guess, kind of reside in a mental space that allows for this shifting of interconnected things. To be aware that your values, again, are only kind of temporary snapshots of reality. And then where I think it starts to look like a suggested course of action in life is when we see him suggesting a kind of way of being, responding spontaneously to things as they really are. So instead of trying to sort of force things to become the way you want them to be, and instead of taking your absolute truths like a Moist or a Confucian would, and sort of rolling your sleeves up and going out into the world to kind of make that happen, you go through life a little bit unsure and trying to take things as they are and then respond to those things. And I think this then starts to point towards another element of his philosophy. This dealing with this, I don't want to say paradoxical, but this challenge involved in being a person in the world, because you might be aware that the universe is all one big totality and you don't really have much control over it. And all these things are uncertain. But at the same time, as a human being, you're kind of stuck being a human being. You don't know everything. You're still a person in the world. How do you kind of live in between these two ways of thinking about the world? So I think we get a taste for it in The Great Ancestral Teacher, which I think is chapter 6, if I remember correctly. To know what heaven does and to know what humans do is to have reached perfection. Those who know what heaven does are born of heaven. Those who know what humans do use what they know to nurture what they know they don't know, living out their heavenly years, not dying along the way. This is the flourishing of knowledge. Now, I won't claim to fully know what he's talking about here, but at the very minimum, he seems to be suggesting that there's a distinction between sort of nature, the things that transpire, the things that happen, the things that aren't at all within your own control, and kind of what humans have within their control, which is very little. So use what you know, sort of nurture what you know you don't know, and then I guess to some extent, maybe this is not a very profound way to summarize Zhuangzi's philosophy, but to some extent, do your best. Sort of try your best, do your best, live, make your way through life in a way that is not particularly harmful. So he's making this distinction. What heaven does is kind of, for Zhuangzi, heaven likely kind of meaning nature, the universe. What people do is kind of the little things we do have some control over. And then he does seem to describe a kind of ideal person, an ideal way to exist in the world. I've seen it translated a number of ways. True person kind of works, I think. Kind of genuine person. Possibly indicating someone who simply is true to who they are and responds to the world the way it really is. So in the midst of all of this confusion and his sort of big philosophies about uncertainty in the way the world is, he seems to be describing his ideal way of existing is to be one of these true people. He's still Zhuangzi, he's still very funny, so he may be exaggerating a bit. He may have some creative flourishes and imagery. So it's hard to know how seriously to take him. But he does seem to think there is a way to kind of live your best life. And I'll just make a side note here. I've already commented Zhuangzi is very influential in Chinese Buddhism much later. But this concept of the true person becomes a very prevalent theme in later Taoist philosophy as well. So what does it mean to be a true person and kind of live in the world in a way that Zhuangzi thinks is good? I think a big part of it is simply finding calm and equanimity. A lot of the people he describes that sound not ideal are often described as very anxious um, or very kind of aggressive. They're trying to make something happen. Zhuangzi's heroes in these stories are usually very calm. They're usually not too bothered by anything. Things come, things go, and they're never too significantly upset about them. And this applies also to how they think about life and how they think about death. So he has this kind of parable here. The true people of the olden days knew nothing of loving life and nothing of hating death. They emerged without delight and returned without resistance. They came and went briskly, nothing more. They neither forgot their beginnings nor sought their end. They enjoyed what they received, forgot it, and handed it back. This is called not using the mind to block the way, not using the human to help heaven. These are called true people. So again, how literally should we take this? It's an open question. But I think you can take it somewhat seriously. I mean, I don't know that Zhuangzi would necessarily say you know nothing of loving life or hating death, that you emerge without delight and return without resistance. Because sometimes the text almost seems to suggest that people should not have any emotions. Um, this is my own reading, which you could certainly disagree with, but I don't think Zhuangzi thinks people should have no feelings at all. But he does seem to think we should have fairly balanced feelings. And that, yeah, we should be kind of open to just taking things as they come and then not getting too caught up with it and then handing it back. And I think that can apply to things that come about in life because we don't really own or control much of what happens to us. And probably to life itself. You receive your life. You're born, you have life. But in the end, you're going to have to hand it back. And you just kind of do that with equanimity. It's like, yep, I'm done with this. And it doesn't kind of obsess you. And he ties this back in to this concept of everything being unified. So he has this description, hence what they like was one, and what they didn't like was one. Their being one was one, and their not being one was one. Seeing it as one, they were followers of heaven. Seeing it as not one, they were followers of humanity. When neither heaven nor humanity wins out over the other, this is called being a true person. And we're going to get to what I think is going on here in a moment. But I think at least part of it is, again, this kind of difficult proposition of being human, that you kind of need to acknowledge the unity of things and accept the world as it is. But if you're going to exist as a person in the world, you're kind of stuck with some of our limited human ways of thinking about things. So it does seem to be maybe this kind of balance that you have to find. I love this passage. I don't know why. So again, I think this is still from the great ancestral teacher. The big lump burdens me with a form. labors me with life, eases me with old age, and rests me with death. So, if I like my life, for the same reason, I must also like my death. The big lump here is I like it. It's a nice turn of phrase. I've also seen it defined or translated as the big clod. It basically just means a big hunk of something, a big ball of dirt, or however you want to view it. And I think he just means the world. He means existence. But he's very playfully describing it in very casual terms. So this big hunk of things that we call the universe. And then he plays with our expectations. He's a bit like Lao Tzu here. He's trying to be counterintuitive. So we have a tendency when we think about life, birth is wonderful, being alive is what you want to cling to and cherish. Aging is bad because you lose your health and your vitality. And death is the worst thing of all because it's kind of terrifying and to be avoided at all costs. Zhuangzi gives a kind of reverse tale of life here, where you're burdened with a form. You didn't ask to be born, but the world sort of gave you one, gave you a birth and gave you a form. You're labored with life. Life is a lot of work and stress and difficulties. It eases you with old age. It maybe lifts some of that burden off of you and then rests you with death. So if I like my life for the same reason, I must also like my death. The great burden or the great lump sort of gave you both. And then finally, it leads to this. I love this passage. I find this one sort of caught my attention. I remember the first time I ever read the Zhuangzi. I was mystified by it, but so he's talking about all these things. He's talking about the true person, seeing things as one, sort of understanding what heaven does and understanding what humans do. And then that passage about the big lump giving you your form, and how if you like your life, you should also like your death. And then we have this strange passage. This maybe points towards what a couple of you said at the beginning of class today, that Zhuangzi just kind of gives these stories and then moves on to the next story, and you still haven't caught up, and it's not clear kind of the point that he's trying to make. But I think here he is kind of leading towards a point. He's sort of building his argument in a very unique Zhuangzian way. So then he has this story. You hide your boat in the ravine and your fishnet in the swamp and tell yourself they will be safe. But in the middle of the night, a strong man shoulders them and carries them off. And in your stupidity, you don't know why it happened. You think you do right to hide little things in big ones, and yet they get away from you. But if you were to hide the world in the world, so that nothing could get away, this would be called the final reality of the constancy of things. So it's a strange little story. So you imagine someone has a boat and a fishing net. They have to go away somewhere, presumably, so they want to hide it. They're like, I don't want someone to find my boat and steal it. So you maybe find a little swamp, you hide it away to make sure no one can find it, you wander off. In the middle of the night, someone strong comes, picks him up, just goes away. So you thought you were being very clever, sort of taking something big, hiding it away in some small corner of the world, and you'd keep it safe. So what does he mean if you were to hide the world in the world? I think this could be read a number of ways, and it could probably apply to a number of situations. But I'll sort of relate it directly to this concept of life and death, which I think it applies to well. So we had that comment earlier with the big lump, that if you love your life, you should also love your death. I think that's kind of what he's getting at here. So imagine that this is a metaphor or an analogy for how we cherish certain things. Just like we cherish that boat, we cherish the net. When we think about our lives, we tend to cherish certain parts of life. We're born, we cherish our youth. Yeah, does the first world mean more of a person's inner self world? I think it can probably apply to a lot of possible readings. My reading here doesn't necessarily directly mean that, but I think that is a plausible reading. I think part of what he's saying here goes back to that concept of the totality of things. How everything is part of one big totality. That also applies to our lives. So while we're alive, we have a tendency to kind of pick the things we really cherish, and we try to kind of protect them. In that sense, it could apply to the inner world, actually. But so, for example, we cherish our youth, and as a result, we hate to grow old. We cherish our wealth, and as a result, we're kind of living in constant anxiety of those things being taken away from us. And most fundamentally, arguably, we cherish our life. And so we spend so much of our lives trying to kind of protect, to hide away the things we really cherish, to stick them somewhere, to keep them kind of close, to make sure that we're never going to lose them. And if we think about life and death in particular, the fact of the matter is life and death coexist. That although we kind of pick life and youth and things like that, we love them, we try to protect them, we try to maintain them. We hate their opposites. We hate losing those things. We hate that death is eventually going to come and get us. But Zhuangzi is saying that this is an approach to life that pretty much guarantees that you're going to be constantly stressed, anxious, and afraid. Because you're trying to avoid the things that are inevitable parts of the whole scope of your existence. Yeah, there's always a beginning and an end, which is inevitable. I think that puts it well. So if you try to cherish your life and hide it away, it doesn't save you. But if you can accept the whole totality of your existence, if you can accept that being alive means dying, that's hiding the world in the world. That means you're accepting the whole picture. You're understanding that life and death are only opposites in your own mind. That you've artificially divided the world up into these opposite things. And you're trying to protect one, and you're trying to avoid the other. But if you can accept the full picture, if you can understand that actually life and death have to coexist, that you literally cannot have one without the other, that's accepting the full scope. That being alive means all these things. Being alive means aging. Being alive means illness. It means pain. It means death. But if you can accept the whole scope of it, you can kind of let go of your anxieties around these scarier parts because you've changed your perspective fundamentally. You're accepting the whole world. You're accepting everything as being part of one total thing. I hope that made some sense. I don't know how well I explained that. But this is kind of his answer to this problem. He's basically saying the problem begins the moment that we try to hide these little things and protect them and think that all these other things around us are bad. If you can kind of let go of that and understand that death is also a part of your life and you can accept that whole picture, then there really is nothing to be anxious about. So what does he mean by, but if you were to hide the world in the world so that nothing could get away, this would be the final reality of constancy of things, then it means that this is what you need to do and a good thing, or is this the nature of existence? My reading is that it's kind of both. That the nature of existence is that to be a human being in the world comes with all those things. And the good thing to do in the world, the kind of course of action he suggests, is to understand and accept that this is the nature of existence. So it's kind of both. It's both understanding the nature of existence and also coming to accept it. That hiding the world in the world means to stop trying to kind of hide and protect just little bits and pieces of life. And hiding the world in the whole world means accepting the whole thing so that nothing can be taken from you. If you accept the full totality of it, then there's nothing else to protect. You've already accepted the whole picture. So yeah, I hope some of that made sense. I hope you have at least a taste of Zhuangzi. I'm never sure how clear any of it is because Zhuangzi is just a tough text. But I guess to kind of conclude, I'd say Zhuangzi offers very few clear answers, partly because he thinks life is a little too messy and complicated to have any really clear answers. But I think you can see connections between his sort of big abstract philosophical ideas like big knowledge and the pivot of the way. And he takes those big philosophical suggestions and says that actually this gives you a kind of idea of a better way to live in the world, one that lets you just kind of let go of a lot of the things that we are anxious about and fear. So it kind of goes back to that point on the first lecture about Zhuangzi, that one way to read his philosophy is as a kind of therapeutic philosophy. Yeah, so I have a question about the penumbra. Sure, yeah, I think we'll have a few minutes left, so we can go back into that one. Yeah, and if there's anything about Zhuangzi's philosophy you don't understand at first reading or listening, that is very reasonable, I think. So yeah, he does kind of offer therapeutic philosophy, and he thinks at the very least it's possible to approach life very differently when you have a different perspective on the world. That's why he kind of digs into these really complicated philosophical, logical, linguistic ideas. He plays around with these really complicated notions of logic and language, but also talks about these fundamental questions of just how to live in the world and how to let go of your anxieties and fears over things like death and illness. So this week's pre-recorded lecture video just adds a few extra points about Zhuangzi's approach to death, and a few other elements of his views on life. So it's going to touch on a very famous story from chapter 3 about this butcher. It'll talk about some of his parables on death. And then next week, when we kind of tie up and sort of look back at Zhuangzi before we look at our next thinker, I want to look at some examples from chapter 19 of some interesting characters that Zhuangzi seems to suggest are good ways to think about life. It kind of ties back to this story of hiding the world in the world in a way, but makes it a little more concrete. Yeah, so that's where we'll end for today. Yeah, we're out of time, so if anyone has to go, feel free to go. Thank you for your patience as we try to work through Zhuangzi. He is a difficult thinker. I'll end the official lecture, but we can go back to the penumbra story because I was asked about that. Yeah, I guess I could keep recording, but if anyone's watching the recording, feel free to end it here too. This is just an additional question. Yeah, so we had the story, Penumbra said to Shadow, first you walk and then you stop, first you sit and then you rise. Why are you so restless? Shadow says, do I depend on something to be the way I am? Does what I depend on also depend on something to be the way it is? So he's kind of using this shadow metaphor, at least this is my reading, to sort of show how everything is interconnected. So a shadow, I think, is a nice example because from our human perspective, if you look and you see a shadow moving around, you don't think, oh, the shadow has chosen to do that. You're aware the movement of the shadow is simply the effect we see as a result of what the person is doing. So if you look at a shadow of a person and you see the shadow, like let's say the shadow of the person lifts its hand. Most people, I think, are not going to think, oh, that shadow just raised its hand. You're thinking, oh, the person raised its hand, which caused the shadow to look like it's also raising its hand. So he's trying to show that, like, when you look at a shadow, we're very aware that the shadow is simply sort of what it is the result largely of other things. The shadow is the result of a person, the sunlight kind of hitting the shadow, it's cast on the ground. Shadow is kind of a product of many different factors. And if the person moves, it changes where the light is being blocked onto the ground. So it's saying the shadow's movement is caused by something else. But then it raises the question, but is that thing that's causing me to do what I'm doing also dependent on other things? And the answer, I think, is yes. So the person, what it's doing is also shaped by all the things in its environment. Why did the person raise their hand? Maybe they saw a friend, they waved their hand at them, and they were responding. So it's kind of like no matter what you look at, the things it's doing and the sort of shape and form that it has is always the result of other influences. And then if you then look at the other things, so the person only raised their hand because they saw their friend. Why did the friend raise their hand? Well, there's a whole story behind why they did that. So it's kind of like everything that we see in the world, each possible thing we can look at is influenced by something else, showing that actually everything is interconnected and you can never kind of pull back far enough or find anything that isn't influenced by other things. So it's kind of this acknowledgement that everything exists as one big total unity of everything influencing everything else, and nothing is ever fully independent. Which again is very Buddhist, so you can see why the Zhuangzi and Buddhism got along well, if you know anything about Buddhist philosophy. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. Is that any clearer? Or if you had any specific questions about that? I'll maybe end the recording at this point.